Have you ever looked at the lives of the saints and wondered what made them different? What made God choose them for extraordinary graces, profound intimacy, visible holiness? Have you ever felt the ache of wanting that closeness with God, but believing it is reserved for people fundamentally unlike you, people more naturally spiritual, more naturally virtuous, more naturally equipped for the kind of relationship with God that seems forever out of reach? What if I told you that everything you believe about being chosen by God is backwards? That the very things you think disqualify you are actually what position you perfectly for His choice? That the weakness you hide, the smallness you apologize for, the ordinariness you despair over, what if these are not obstacles but invitations? What would change if you discovered that God's choice has nothing to do with your qualifications and everything to do with your willingness? That being chosen is not about becoming worthy enough to catch His attention, but about becoming small enough to receive what He is already trying to give. Can you imagine what it would feel like to stop striving to be chosen and simply accept that you already are? To stop trying to earn what grace has already granted? To stop performing for a God who is not waiting for your performance, but for your trust? This is not theory. This is not wishful thinking. This is the lived wisdom of someone who discovered the secret of being chosen by God, not through greatness, but through littleness, not through achievement, but through surrender, not through making herself worthy, but through accepting that worthiness was never the requirement. Saint Thérèse of Lisieux was chosen by God, profoundly chosen, intimately chosen, chosen for graces that transformed her into one of the most influential saints in church history, despite living a hidden life in a small convent and dying at 24. But here is what makes her wisdom essential. She was not chosen because she was extraordinary. She was chosen because she understood something about how God chooses that most people completely miss, and what she understood will shatter every assumption you have about what it takes to be close to God. The question is not how to be chosen by God. The question is how to recognize that you already have been, and what that recognition requires you to release. Most people approach God like they are applying for a position. They compile their spiritual resume. Prayer hours logged, sacrifices made, virtues practiced, sins avoided. They present themselves hoping to be impressive enough, dedicated enough, holy enough to warrant God's attention. They believe being chosen is the result of sufficient spiritual achievement, the reward for reaching some threshold of worthiness. And they are exhausted, because no matter how much they do, it never feels like enough. No matter how far they progress, the gap between where they are and where they think they need to be never seems to close. No matter how hard they try, they still feel like they are on the outside looking in at an intimacy with God that others seem to possess, but that eludes them. Have you felt this exhaustion? This sense that you are always trying to qualify for something that remains perpetually out of reach? This quiet despair that maybe you are simply not the kind of person God chooses for deep relationship? If so, you are operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of how being chosen by God actually works. And Thérèse spent her entire spiritual life dismantling this misunderstanding, first in herself, then in everyone who encountered her wisdom. Because here is the truth that changes everything. God does not choose based on worthiness. He chooses based on receptivity. He does not look for the most qualified. He looks for the most open. He does not wait for you to become impressive. He waits for you to become available. And availability has nothing to do with what you achieve, and everything to do with what you acknowledge. Specifically, what you acknowledge about your own poverty, your own need, your own absolute dependence on grace for everything. Thérèse discovered this not through mystical revelation, but through honest self-examination. She looked at herself clearly, at her weaknesses, her limitations, her inability to climb to holiness through her own strength, and instead of despairing, she made a decision that changed everything. She decided to stop trying to make herself worthy of being chosen, and instead to trust that God chooses precisely those who know they are unworthy. This is the scandal of her little way. It suggests that your smallness is not what disqualifies you from being chosen. It is what qualifies you. That your weakness is not what keeps God at a distance. It is what draws Him close. That your poverty is not a barrier to intimacy. It is the doorway. Let me ask you something honestly. What if God is already trying to choose you, but you keep refusing the terms of that choice? What if He is reaching for you, but you are insisting He wait until you are more impressive? What if the intimacy you long for is available right now, but you cannot receive it because you are still trying to earn it? This is where most people get stuck. They want to be chosen, desperately. But they want to be chosen for reasons that make them feel good about themselves. They want to believe they earned it through effort, deserved it through dedication, qualified for it through achievement. They want God's choice to validate their spiritual competence rather than expose their spiritual poverty. But that is not how God chooses. Not because He is arbitrary or cruel or disinterested in your efforts, but because the kind of intimacy He offers, the kind of union He desires, is only possible with souls who have stopped trying to earn it and started trusting that it is gift. Thérèse understood this through a simple but profound realization. She was reading scripture one day and encountered the verse, "Whoever is a little one, let him come to me." And something clicked. She had been trying to become big, big in virtue, big in sacrifice, big in holiness, so that God would notice her. But God was not calling the big. He was calling the little. Not the strong, but the weak. Not the impressive, but the needy. And she was little. She was weak. She was needy. Not by accident, but by design. And instead of spending her life fighting against this reality, she decided to embrace it, to stop apologizing for her smallness and start trusting that God was not waiting for her to grow beyond it, but was inviting her to come to Him precisely in it. This is the first secret of being chosen by God. You must become little. Not pretend to be little while secretly believing you should be big. Not perform littleness as a spiritual technique, but genuinely, honestly acknowledge that you are small, weak, dependent, incapable of reaching God through your own strength, and trust that this acknowledgement is not what disqualifies you, but what positions you perfectly for His choice. Have you ever tried this? Not just intellectually assenting to the idea that you need grace, but actually living as someone who knows they are completely dependent on it, actually approaching God not with achievements to present, but with poverty to expose. Actually admitting that everything good in your spiritual life is gift rather than accomplishment. Most people have not. Because admitting true poverty feels like failure. It feels like you are not trying hard enough, not progressing fast enough, not taking your spiritual life seriously enough. It feels shameful to be small when the spiritual culture around you rewards bigness, big commitments, big sacrifices, big visible holiness. But Thérèse discovered that this shame is the last barrier between you and being chosen, because as long as you are ashamed of your smallness, you will keep trying to hide it. You will keep presenting an inflated version of yourself to God. You will keep performing competence instead of exposing need. And in that performance, you make yourself unavailable to the very thing God wants to give you, the experience of being loved not for what you achieve but for who you are. This is why Jesus said you must become like a child to enter the kingdom. Not because children are innocent, they are not. Not because children are naturally virtuous, they are not. But because children know they are dependent. They do not pretend to be self-sufficient. They do not try to earn their place in the family. They simply receive what is given and trust the one who gives it. And when you stop trying to be an adult, proving your worth, and start being a child receiving love, everything about your relationship with God transforms. You stop measuring your spiritual progress and start resting in His promises. You stop managing your worthiness and start trusting His mercy. You stop trying to climb to Him and start letting Him carry you. This is what it means to be chosen by God. Not to be selected from a lineup of candidates based on superior qualifications, but to be gathered up by a Father who was never waiting for you to become impressive, but was only waiting for you to stop pretending you already are. Thérèse once wrote something that scandalized many of her contemporaries and still challenges people today. She wrote, "What pleases God in my little soul is seeing me love my littleness and my poverty, seeing my blind hope in His mercy." Notice what pleases God, not her great virtues, though she had them, not her heroic sacrifices, though she made them, not her spiritual achievements, though they were real. What pleases God is her love of her own littleness, her embrace of her poverty, her blind hope in mercy, when she has nothing else to stand on. This is the posture of someone who has been chosen, not the posture of achievement, but the posture of reception, not the stance of proving, but the stance of trusting, not the effort of climbing, but the surrender of being carried. And the beautiful paradox is this: the moment you stop trying to make yourself worthy of being chosen, you discover that you already have been. The moment you release the project of spiritual self-improvement and embrace your poverty, you find that God has been choosing you all along. You were just too busy trying to qualify to notice that qualification was never required. Let me ask you something that might be difficult. Can you love your littleness? Not tolerate it while secretly wishing you were bigger. Not accept it as a temporary state you are working to overcome, but genuinely love it. See it as the place where God meets you, the condition that makes His mercy necessary, the poverty that creates space for grace to fill. If you can, you have discovered what Thérèse discovered. If you cannot yet, you are still operating in the economy of merit where love must be earned, worthiness must be achieved, and being chosen depends on becoming someone other than who you are. But God does not operate in that economy. He operates in the economy of gift. And in that economy, being chosen has nothing to do with what you bring and everything to do with what you are willing to receive. There is a profound shift that happens when you move from trying to be chosen to accepting that you already are. It is not just a change in belief, it is a reorientation of your entire spiritual life. Everything you thought you knew about how to relate to God gets turned upside down. When you are trying to be chosen, prayer becomes performance. You pray to prove your dedication. You measure the quality of your prayer by how it makes you feel, how long you sustain it, how consistently you maintain it. You approach God hoping He will be impressed by your effort, moved by your persistence, convinced by your sincerity that you deserve His attention. But when you accept that you are already chosen, prayer becomes conversation. You pray not to prove anything, but to be present to someone who already knows you completely and loves you anyway. You measure the quality of your prayer not by what you produce, but by your willingness to show up. You approach God not hoping to impress, but trusting you are already welcomed, already heard, already held in a love that has nothing to do with your performance. Have you ever experienced this difference? The shift from prayer as something you must do correctly to earn God's favor, to prayer as simply being with someone who already favors you, from prayer as spiritual work that might eventually make you worthy, to prayer as rest in a worthiness already declared over you. This shift touches everything. When you are trying to be chosen, every failure feels catastrophic. Every sin feels like evidence that you are not making progress, not doing enough, not the kind of person God would choose. Every fall becomes proof that you are disqualified, that the distance between you and God is your fault, that you need to try harder, do better, finally get it right before you can approach Him with confidence. But when you accept that you are already chosen, failure becomes opportunity. Not opportunity to despair, but opportunity to experience mercy. Every sin becomes a chance to return to God and discover again that His love is not conditional on your perfection. Every fall becomes an invitation to let Him pick you up, to feel His arms around you, to know experientially that being chosen has never been about your ability to avoid falling, but about your willingness to let Him lift you every time you do. Thérèse fell regularly. She describes in her writings moments of impatience, irritation, spiritual dryness, weakness in virtue. She did not become a saint because she never failed. She became a saint because she never let failure convince her that God had withdrawn His choice. She would fall and immediately return to Him, not with elaborate apologies or promises to do better, but with simple trust. You see what I am, Lord. Without you I can do nothing, but I trust you love me anyway. This is the freedom of living as someone already chosen. You no longer have to hide your failures from God. You no longer have to pretend you are more than you are. You no longer have to exhaust yourself maintaining an image of spiritual competence. You can simply be honest, brutally, completely honest about your poverty, your weakness, your ongoing need for mercy. And in that honesty you discover that God is not scandalized, He is not disappointed, He is not reconsidering His choice of you. He already knew. He has always known, and he chose you anyway. Not in spite of your weakness, but knowing it completely. Not waiting for you to become someone else, but reaching for you exactly as you are. Let me ask you something that cuts to the heart of this. When was the last time you approached God with complete honesty about where you actually are spiritually? Not where you wish you were, not where you think you should be, not the carefully curated version of yourself that you present in prayer, but the real you, with all the struggles you are still losing, all the virtues you still lack, all the ways you are still falling short of what you know God desires. Most people never do this, not because they are dishonest, but because they believe honesty will disqualify them. They fear that if God sees them as they really are, if he sees the full extent of their weakness, their ongoing failures, their persistent struggles, he will withdraw his love, his presence, his choice. But this fear is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how God sees you. You think he is waiting for you to become impressive before he fully embraces you. You think his love grows as your holiness grows. You think being chosen is a status you earn through sufficient spiritual progress. But Thérèse discovered the opposite. She discovered that God's love is not response to your holiness. His love is what makes holiness possible. He does not choose you because you are worthy. He chooses you, and his choice makes you worthy. He does not wait for you to become someone he can love. He loves you exactly as you are, and that love transforms you into someone who can receive it. This is the second secret of being chosen by God, and it flows directly from the first. You must bring your actual self to God, not your idealized self. You must stop presenting the person you wish you were and start being honest about the person you actually are. You must risk the vulnerability of letting God see you completely, including the parts you are most ashamed of, most disappointed by, most convinced disqualify you from his love. And here is what happens when you do. You discover that God already knows. He has always known. Every weakness you are afraid to admit, he already sees. Every failure you try to hide, he already witnessed. Every struggle you think makes you unworthy of being chosen, he already factored into his decision to choose you anyway. Thérèse lived this radical honesty. When she felt cold in prayer, she told God. When she struggled with impatience, she admitted it immediately. When she felt no consolation, no sweetness, no evidence that her spiritual life was progressing, she brought that poverty to God without pretense. She did not manufacture feelings she did not have. She did not perform devotion she did not feel. She simply showed up as she was and trusted that God desired her honest poverty more than her fake progress. Have you ever tried this kind of honesty? Have you ever gone to prayer and said to God, "I do not feel close to you right now. I am struggling with this sin again. I am dry, distracted, doubting whether any of this is working. But I am here anyway because I trust you love me even in this state." This is the prayer of someone who has accepted being chosen, not the prayer of someone trying to impress God with their spiritual depth, but the prayer of someone who knows that being chosen has nothing to do with how impressive they are and everything to do with how honest they can be. And here is the beautiful thing about this honesty. It does not push God away. It draws him close. Because God is not waiting for you to have it all together. He is waiting for you to stop pretending you do. He is not moved by your strength. He is moved by your admission of weakness. He is not impressed by your spiritual accomplishments. He is pleased by your willingness to come to him with empty hands and simply say, "I have nothing, but I trust you have everything I need." This brings us to a dimension of being chosen that most people never consider. Being chosen by God is not primarily about what God does for you. It is about what God does through you. And what he does through you has very little to do with your qualifications and everything to do with your availability. Thérèse understood this profoundly. She had enormous desires. She wanted to be a missionary, a martyr, a priest, a doctor of the church. She wanted to do great things for God. Her heart burned with ambitions that seemed completely out of reach for a young woman in a cloistered convent in 19th century France. Most people in her position would have done one of two things: suppressed their desires as unrealistic, or spent their lives resenting the limitations that prevented them from achieving what they longed for. But Thérèse did neither. She held her great desires and her small capacity together and said to God, "I cannot do these things, but you can. And if you want to do them through me, I make myself available. This is the key. Being chosen is not about having the capacity to do what God calls you to do. It is about making yourself available for God to do it through you, not by becoming more capable, but by becoming more surrendered, not by increasing your strength, but by acknowledging your weakness so completely that God's strength has room to work. Think about this carefully. What if the calling you sense, the thing you feel God might be asking of you but that seems completely beyond your capacity, what if that impossibility is not a problem, but the point? What if God is deliberately calling you to something you cannot do, so that when it gets done, everyone, including you, knows it was His work, not yours? This is how God operates, not by selecting people who can do the job on their own, but by choosing people who know they cannot, and then doing it through them anyway, not to humiliate them, but to free them. Because when you know you are not capable, you stop trying to take credit. You stop measuring your worth by the results. You stop anxiously managing the outcomes. You simply make yourself available and let God work. Thérèse called this being God's plaything, a phrase that scandalized some people because it sounds passive, childish, even demeaning. But she meant something profound by it. A plaything in the hands of a child has no agenda, no resistance, no insistence on being used in a particular way. It simply allows itself to be picked up, moved, used according to the child's will, delighting the child by its availability rather than its competence. This is what it means to be chosen by God. Not to be competent enough to accomplish His purposes on your own, but to be available enough to let Him accomplish His purposes through you. Not to have all the answers, all the strength, all the qualifications, but to have the trust that says, I do not know how this will work, but I know you can work through me if I simply stay surrendered. Let me ask you, what would change in your life if you stopped trying to become qualified for what God is calling you to and started making yourself available instead? What if you stopped measuring whether you are capable enough and started asking whether you are surrendered enough? What if being chosen is not about your competence, but about your willingness to let God work through your acknowledged incompetence? This shifts everything, because it means you no longer have to wait until you feel ready. You no longer have to reach some threshold of capability before you can step into what God is calling you toward. You simply have to be honest about your poverty and trust that God can work through it, that He actually prefers to work through it because it keeps you dependent, humble, constantly aware that whatever happens is grace. Thérèse never felt ready. She never felt capable. She never reached a point where she looked at herself and thought, now I am qualified to do what God is calling me to do. She remained little, weak, consciously dependent her entire life. Yet God worked through her in ways that continue to impact millions of souls more than a century after her death. How? Not because she became impressive, but because she remained available, not because she achieved greatness on her own, but because she stayed small enough that God's greatness could shine through her, without her ego getting in the way. Not because she earned the right to be used by God, but because she accepted that being chosen was never about earning but about receiving. And here is where the wisdom of the little way becomes intensely practical. If being chosen is about availability rather than capability, then the daily question is not, am I good enough yet? But, am I surrendered enough today? Not, have I progressed sufficiently? But am I making myself available to whatever God wants to do through me right now? This changes how you approach your daily life. You stop waiting for the big moment when you will finally be ready to do something significant for God. You start seeing every small moment as an opportunity to make yourself available. You stop measuring your worth by major achievements and start measuring your faithfulness by small surrenders. Thérèse practiced this constantly. Every small task became an opportunity to make herself available to God. Folding laundry, sweeping floors, bearing with a difficult sister, smiling when she felt irritated. None of these were impressive acts, but each one was a moment of saying, God, I am here, I am available. Use this moment however you want. And in the accumulation of thousands of these small availabilities, God did something extraordinary that she never witnessed during her lifetime, but that continues to transform lives across the world. Have you ever considered that your daily life, the ordinary, repetitive, seemingly insignificant tasks that fill your hours, might be the primary place where God is asking you to be available. Not someday when you have more time, more resources, more capability. But today, in the small moments you are tempted to dismiss as not mattering. What if being chosen by God is less about being tapped for some grand mission and more about being faithful in small availabilities? What if the extraordinary work God wants to do through you happens not in spite of your ordinary life, but through your willingness to bring Him your ordinary life with extraordinary surrender? This is the scandal of the little way. It suggests that you do not need to wait for dramatic circumstances to live as someone chosen by God. You do not need special opportunities, unique gifts, or exceptional situations. You simply need to bring ordinary moments to God with the availability that says, I am yours, this moment is yours. Do with both whatever pleases you. And when you live this way, when you make availability rather than capability your measure of faithfulness, you discover something that transforms your entire understanding of what it means to be chosen. God is not waiting for you to become someone else before He can use you. He wants to use you exactly as you are, exactly where you are, in the exact circumstances you find yourself today. Not someday when you are holier, today in your poverty, not eventually when you are stronger, now in your weakness, not later when you finally feel ready. This moment in your honest acknowledgement that you will never be ready on your own, but you are willing to be used anyway. Thérèse discovered that this kind of availability, this daily, moment-by-moment surrender of small opportunities, was not settling for less than God desired. It was accessing the fullness of what He offers. Because God does not need you to do great things to accomplish His purposes. He needs you to be available in small things. He needs you to stop waiting for impressive opportunities and start seizing ordinary moments. He needs you to bring Him, not your imagined future competence, but your actual present poverty, and trust that He can work with it. Let me ask you one more time. Can you be available today? Not capable. You are not, and that is fine. Not impressive. You will not be, and that is not what God is asking. But available. Willing to bring your ordinary moments to God and let Him do with them whatever He desires. Willing to stop measuring your worth by what you accomplish and start measuring your faithfulness by how completely you surrender what you have, however small, to the One who can multiply it beyond anything you could produce on your own. This is what it means to be chosen by God. And the beautiful truth is, you do not have to become someone else to live it. You simply have to stop trying to be someone else and start being fully honestly available as exactly who you are. There is a dimension of being chosen that runs even deeper than availability, and it is the dimension where most people either break through to authentic intimacy with God or remain stuck in a performance-based relationship that exhausts them while never satisfying. This dimension is trust, not general belief that God exists or that He is good, but specific, personal, radical trust that His choice of you is not conditional on your worthiness and never will be. This kind of trust is rare. Most Christians believe intellectually that God loves them. They can recite that His mercy is infinite, that grace is freely given, that salvation is not earned. But when you examine how they actually live, how they approach God after failure, how they measure their relationship with Him, how they respond when they fall short, you discover that underneath the orthodox theology, they are still operating as if God's love must be earned, maintained, proven worthy of, through consistent spiritual performance. Thérèse saw this pattern everywhere. She saw people who believed in God's mercy in theory, but lived in constant anxiety about whether they had done enough to deserve it in practice. She saw souls who confessed faith in grace, but measured their relationship with God by their recent track record. She saw believers who spoke of God's unconditional love, but approached Him with the constant fear that the next failure might be the one that finally exhausts His patience. And she knew this was not trust. This was fear dressed in religious language. This was the anxiety of someone who has not yet grasped that being chosen by God is permanent, unconditional, utterly independent of their performance. Have you ever examined your own relationship with God through this lens? Have you ever noticed the gap between what you say you believe about His love and how you actually feel after you fail? Between the theology of grace you affirm and the anxiety of performance you carry? Between your intellectual knowledge that you are saved by mercy and your emotional certainty that you must maintain that mercy through good behavior? This gap reveals where trust has not yet penetrated. It shows the places where you are still trying to earn what has already been freely given. It exposes the subtle ways you have made God's choice of you conditional, even while claiming to believe it is not. Thérèse's breakthrough came when she stopped trying to bridge this gap through better theology and started living into a trust so radical it scandalized people. She began to treat God's choice of her as absolutely settled, not something she had to maintain, not something she could lose through failure, not something that fluctuated based on her spiritual state. Just settled, permanent, irrevocable. This did not mean she became careless about sin. It meant she stopped letting sin convince her that God had withdrawn His love. When she failed, she did not spiral into anxiety about whether she had damaged her relationship with God. She simply returned to Him immediately, with the confidence of a child who knows that a parent's love is not dependent on perfect behavior. Think about how a small child responds after doing something wrong. If the child trusts the parent's love, what happens? The child might feel sorry, might cry, might run to the parent for comfort. But the child does not doubt the parent's love, does not wonder if this failure has finally exhausted the parent's patience, does not stay away in shame, trying to be good enough to approach again. The child runs toward the parent, not away, because trust in the parent's love is deeper than awareness of personal failure. This is the trust Thérèse embodied. This is what it means to be chosen by God and actually live like you believe it. Not performance anxiety disguised as devotion, not constant measuring of whether you are doing enough, not the exhausting project of maintaining God's love through consistent spiritual achievement. Just trust, simple, childlike, radical trust, that His choice of you is not based on your worthiness and therefore cannot be undone by your unworthiness. Let me ask you something that might sting. Do you trust God's choice of you, or are you constantly trying to re-earn it? Do you approach Him after failure with the confidence of someone who knows they are loved, or with the anxiety of someone who fears they might have finally gone too far? Do you live like you are chosen permanently, or like you are on probation, constantly one mistake away from losing what you never fully believed you had in the first place? This matters more than you might realize, because the level of trust you have in God's choice determines the level of intimacy you can experience with Him. If you do not trust that His choice is permanent, you will never fully open yourself to Him. You will always hold something back, always maintain some distance, always keep one eye on your performance to make sure you are doing enough to keep Him interested. But when you trust, when you genuinely, deeply trust that being chosen by God is settled, and nothing you do can undo it, then you can finally be completely honest. You can bring your failures without fear. You can expose your weakness without shame. You can show God your actual self rather than the carefully managed version you think He requires. And in that honesty, you discover an intimacy that performance-based religion can never produce. Thérèse described this intimacy as being able to tell Jesus everything. Not just the good things, not just the spiritual victories, everything, the petty irritations, the moments of pride, the struggles that never seem to get better, the temptations that keep returning, the doubts that whisper in the darkness, all of it, because she trusted that Jesus already knew all of it and loved her anyway, and that bringing it to Him honestly was not weakness, but the pathway to deeper union. Have you ever experienced this kind of transparency with God? Have you ever brought Him not just your sins, but your ongoing struggles? Not just your failures, but your frustrations with yourself? Not just your requests for help, but your honest feelings about why the help seems slow in coming? Not just your love for Him, but your confusion about why that love feels so inconsistent? Most people have not, because most people do not trust enough to be that honest. They fear that too much honesty will push God away, that exposing the full extent of their weakness will make Him reconsider His choice, that being real about their struggles will convince Him they are not taking the spiritual life seriously enough. But Thérèse discovered the opposite. She discovered that nothing draws God closer than honest poverty, That He is not offended by your weakness. He already knows about it. He is not surprised by your struggles. He has been watching them all along. He is not scandalized by your failures. He factored them into His decision to choose you from the beginning. What moves God is not your ability to hide your poverty from Him. It is your willingness to bring it to Him, not your strength in overcoming weakness, but your trust in showing Him the weakness that remains, not your success in maintaining a facade of spiritual competence, but your courage in dropping the facade and letting Him see the struggling, inconsistent, often confused soul underneath. This brings us to the third secret of being chosen by God, and it is perhaps the most counterintuitive. You must decrease. Not temporarily while you build strength, not strategically as a spiritual technique, but genuinely, progressively, make yourself smaller rather than bigger in your own estimation. This is the opposite of how most spiritual growth is framed. Most paths teach you to grow in virtue, expand in capability, increase in spiritual strength. They measure progress by how much more you can do, how much further you can reach, how much bigger your capacity for God becomes. But the little way measures progress differently. It measures progress by how much more you recognize your need for God, how much more aware you become of your dependence on grace, how much smaller you realize you are in the face of His immensity, how much less you rely on your own strength, and how much more you rely on His. This is growth by subtraction, not addition. It is maturity measured by increasing humility, not increasing competence. It is advancement toward God through becoming smaller in your own eyes, not larger. Have you ever been taught this kind of spiritual growth? Have you ever heard that the goal is to become more consciously dependent rather than more functionally capable? That spiritual maturity looks like knowing you need God more desperately at the end of your life than you did at the beginning. Probably not, because it sounds like you are not progressing. It sounds like an excuse for staying weak. It sounds like spiritual immaturity disguised as humility. But Thérèse understood something profound. The biggest obstacle to intimacy with God is your conviction that you are bringing something essential to the relationship, that God needs your strength, your virtue, your holiness to accomplish His purposes, that you must become more impressive before He can truly use you. This conviction, however unconscious, keeps you focused on yourself, on building yourself up, on measuring your progress, on trying to become the kind of person worthy of being chosen. And all of that self-focus, all of that striving to be bigger and better and more capable, actually prevents the very intimacy you are working toward. Because intimacy with God requires space. It requires emptiness that He can fill. It requires poverty that His riches can address. It requires weakness that His strength can uphold. And as long as you are full of yourself, full of your achievements, your capabilities, your sense of what you are bringing to the relationship, there is no room for God to fill you with Himself. Thérèse practiced decrease deliberately. When she succeeded at something, she immediately gave God the credit. When people praised her, she redirected that praise to God. When she was tempted to pride over some spiritual progress, she reminded herself that everything good in her came from grace, not from her own effort. She was systematically, intentionally making herself smaller in her own estimation, not because she was naturally humble. Her diary reveals ongoing battles with pride, not because she lacked ambition, her desires were enormous, but because she understood that smallness is not the failure of the spiritual life, it is the goal. Because only when you are small enough to know you are completely dependent can you receive the fullness of what God wants to give. Think of it this way: a cup can hold more water when it is empty than when it is already partially full. If you are already full of yourself, full of spiritual pride, full of confidence in your own capabilities, full of the sense that you are doing pretty well on your own, there is limited space for God to pour Himself into you. But when you empty yourself, when you decrease, when you acknowledge how small you are, when you recognize your absolute dependence, you create capacity. Not capacity that you fill through your own effort, but capacity that God fills with Himself. And that filling is what transforms you, not your work on yourself, but His work in you, not what you accomplish through striving, but what He accomplishes through your surrender. Let me ask you directly, are you willing to decrease? Are you willing to make it your daily practice to acknowledge how much you need God, how little you can do without Him, how dependent you are on grace for absolutely everything? Are you willing to stop trying to become more impressive in your own eyes and start becoming more aware of your poverty? This is hard. Everything in contemporary spirituality pushes in the opposite direction. You are told to develop your gifts, expand your capacities, grow in strength. You are measured by how much you achieve, how far you reach, how capable you become. Decrease sounds like failure in that framework, but in the little way, decrease is progress, because it moves you from self-reliance to God-reliance, from trusting in your own spiritual work to trusting in His grace, from trying to earn intimacy to receiving it as gift, from the exhausting project of making yourself worthy to the restful acceptance that you never will be, and you do not need to be. And when you finally embrace decrease, when you stop fighting against your smallness and start seeing it as the place where God meets you most intimately, you discover what Thérèse discovered, that you do not become less, you become more. Not more in your own strength, but more filled with His. Not more capable on your own, but more available to His power working through you. Not more impressive to others, but more intimate with Him. This is the paradox of the little way. By becoming smaller, you become greater. Not greater in yourself, but greater in what God can do through you. Not greater by your own measure, but greater by His. Not the greatness the world recognizes, but the greatness heaven values. The greatness of a soul so small, so surrendered, so completely dependent, that God can work through it without obstruction. Now we arrive at the question that ties everything together, the question that determines whether all of this remains beautiful theory or becomes transformative practice. How do you actually live as someone chosen by God? Not how do you think about it, not how do you understand it theologically, but how do you walk through your actual daily life with the lived reality that you have been chosen permanently, unconditionally, irrevocably? Thérèse would answer this question not with a program or a method or a set of spiritual exercises, but with a single word: presence. You live as someone chosen by God by being present to Him in the present moment, not in some imagined future when you will finally be holy enough, not in some idealized version of yourself that does not yet exist, but right now exactly as you are, in the exact circumstances you find yourself. This sounds simple. It is not, because most people spend their entire lives anywhere but the present moment. They live in the past, reviewing failures, rehearsing regrets, replaying conversations they wish they had handled differently. Or they live in the future, worrying about what might happen, planning how they will finally get their spiritual life in order, imagining the person they will become someday when they are more disciplined, more committed, more consistent. But God meets you in the present, not in yesterday's failure or tomorrow's resolve, in this moment, right here, right now. Exactly as you are, not as you wish you were or plan to be. And being present to Him in this moment requires something most people find almost impossible: accepting where you actually are spiritually, rather than constantly measuring it against where you think you should be. Bringing Him what you actually have, rather than apologizing for what you lack. Working with your real limitations, rather than waiting until they are overcome. Let me ask you honestly, how much of your spiritual energy is consumed by wishing you were different? How much mental space is occupied by the gap between who you are and who you think you should be? How much time do you spend in regret over yesterday's failures or anxiety about whether you will do better tomorrow, instead of simply being present to God today? This is what prevents most people from experiencing the intimacy that comes from being chosen. Not that they are not chosen, they are. But that they cannot be present to the God who has chosen them because they are too busy managing the past, controlling the future, or trying to become someone other than who they actually are. Thérèse practiced presence through what she called her little way of spiritual childhood. But underneath that sweet-sounding name was something radically demanding: the discipline of staying in the present moment with God, regardless of what that moment contained. Whether she felt close to God or far from Him, whether prayer was sweet or dry, whether she was succeeding or failing, she practiced simply being present to Him as she actually was, not as she wished she were. This meant when prayer was dry, she did not spend the time wishing it were different or condemning herself for the dryness. She simply stayed present to God in the dryness. When she felt cold toward him, she did not manufacture emotions she did not feel. She simply told him honestly, "I feel nothing right now, but I am here anyway because I trust you are here whether I feel it or not." Have you ever tried this? Have you ever stayed present to God in a moment when everything in you wanted to escape, when prayer felt pointless, when you felt distant from Him, when you could not sense His presence at all? Have you ever resisted the urge to fill the uncomfortable silence with spiritual busywork and simply remained in it, trusting that presence itself is the prayer, that showing up is the offering, that being there is what He desires more than any feeling or achievement? This is extraordinarily difficult, because staying present when things are not going well spiritually feels like failure. It feels like you should be doing something to fix it, to make progress, to get yourself into a better spiritual state. Every instinct tells you that sitting in dryness is wasting time, that you should be working harder to generate the feelings and experiences you think real prayer should produce. But Thérèse discovered that this instinct is exactly what prevents intimacy, because it keeps you focused on yourself, on your performance, your progress, your ability to produce spiritual experiences. And as long as you are focused on yourself, you cannot be fully present to God. You are too busy managing yourself to simply be with Him. The shift happens when you stop trying to have a good prayer time and start simply being present to the one who is already present to you. When you stop measuring the quality of your relationship with God by how it makes you feel, and start measuring it by your willingness to show up regardless of how it feels. When you stop trying to become someone worthy of intimacy and start accepting that intimacy is already available to you exactly as you are, this is what it means to live as someone chosen by God. Not to live perfectly, not to always feel close to Him, not to achieve some consistent spiritual high, but to live in the constant awareness that you are loved, chosen, held by God right now in this moment, with these feelings or lack of feelings, with this success or this failure, exactly as you are. And when you begin to live this way, something extraordinary happens, not dramatic, not always noticeable, but real. You begin to experience God not as someone you must reach through sufficient effort, but as someone who has already reached you. You begin to relate to Him not as a goal to achieve, but as a presence to receive. You begin to understand that being chosen is not about what you do, but about what you allow yourself to receive, to trust, to rest in. Thérèse died at 24. She had lived in a small convent. She had never done anything the world would call impressive. She had struggled with spiritual dryness, physical suffering, and the constant awareness of her own smallness. By every external measure, she had accomplished nothing. Yet she died knowing she was profoundly, completely, eternally chosen by God. Not because she had earned it, not because she had achieved spiritual greatness, but because she had learned to receive it. She had learned to be small enough, honest enough, present enough, to accept what God had been trying to give her all along. The experience of being loved exactly as she was, not as she wished she were. And in accepting that, in living every day as someone chosen not for her worthiness but despite her unworthiness, she became one of the most influential saints in church history, not through what she did, but through what she received, not through her greatness, but through her willingness to remain little, not through her spiritual achievements, but through her trust in God's mercy. Within decades of her death, millions of people across the world were invoking her intercession. Her autobiography, written under obedience to her superiors, became a spiritual classic. Pope after pope praised her wisdom. She was declared a doctor of the Church, one of only 4 women ever given that title, despite having lived such a hidden, ordinary life. What happened? How did someone so small become so influential? How did someone who accomplished so little during her life accomplish so much after it? The answer is that she was chosen, truly, deeply, powerfully chosen by God. Not because she made herself worthy, but because she accepted being chosen on the only terms God offers, as pure gift. Not as reward for achievement, but as love freely given to the unworthy, who trust it is freely given. And here is what her life reveals to you. You are chosen the same way, with the same unconditional love, with the same permanent commitment, with the same invitation to stop trying to earn it and start living in the reality of it. The question is not whether you are chosen. You are. God chose you before you did anything to deserve it, and His choice remains regardless of what you do to deserve it or fail to deserve it. The question is whether you will accept being chosen on these terms, whether you will stop trying to qualify and start trusting that grace has already qualified you, whether you will become small enough, honest enough, present enough to receive what has been available all along. Let me ask you one final time, can you accept that you are chosen? Not someday when you become more impressive, not eventually when you finally get your spiritual life together, but right now, today, in this moment, exactly as you are, with all your weakness, all your failure, all your ongoing struggle. Can you believe that God is not waiting for you to become someone else before He fully embraces you? That His choice of you is permanent and nothing you do can undo it? That being chosen is not about your worthiness, but about His mercy. If you can make this shift from trying to be chosen to accepting that you already are, everything changes. Prayer becomes conversation instead of performance. Failure becomes opportunity for mercy instead of evidence of disqualification. Your daily life becomes the place where intimacy happens instead of the obstacle you must overcome to achieve intimacy. You stop exhausting yourself trying to qualify and start resting in the qualification grace has already given. You stop measuring your worth by your spiritual progress and start measuring it by God's unchanging declaration that you are beloved. You stop trying to become someone worthy of being chosen and start living as someone who has already been chosen and learning what that means. This is the wisdom of Sainte Thérèse of Lisieux. This is the little way. This is how to be chosen by God, not by becoming worthy enough to catch His attention, but by becoming small enough to receive His love, not by achieving greatness, but by accepting littleness, not by earning intimacy, but by trusting it is already yours. You are chosen. You have always been chosen. God is not waiting for you to become someone else. He is waiting for you to accept being loved as exactly who you are. And when you finally do, when you stop fighting against your smallness and start embracing it as the place where God meets you, when you stop trying to hide your poverty and start bringing it to Him honestly, when you stop measuring your worth by your achievements and start resting in His mercy, you discover what Thérèse discovered. That being chosen by God is not the end of a long journey of self-improvement. It is the beginning of a relationship that was always available, but that you could not receive while you were too busy trying to earn it. That the intimacy you have been seeking through effort is actually accessible through surrender. That the love you have been trying to qualify for has been pursuing you all along. That the God you have been trying to reach has already reached you and is simply waiting for you to notice. This is how you are chosen by God, not by climbing to Him, but by letting Him carry you, not by becoming worthy, but by accepting that worthiness was never the requirement, not by achieving greatness, but by trusting that His choice of you, His permanent, unconditional, irrevocable choice, makes you greater than any achievement ever could. Stop trying to be chosen. You already are. Accept it. Live it. Let it transform everything about how you relate to God, to yourself, to your daily life. Let it free you from the exhausting project of earning love and allow you to rest in receiving it. This is the secret. This is the wisdom. This is what Sainte Thérèse lived and died to reveal, that you do not need to become someone else to be chosen by God. You only need to become small enough, honest enough, trusting enough to accept that you already have been. And that acceptance, that simple, radical, life-transforming acceptance changes everything.